Well, first off, I just want to say a very special thank you to the San Francisco Public Library for helping us to promote this series and to get the word out with community. The pathways to home ownership is what we are aiming for here, and ensuring that we are securing and stabilizing people's assets with every tool that we have. Quite often, those pathways to home ownership and building the equity within communities that we seek to realize is often hindered by inequities within current home lending and appraisal processes. And we know that research shows that disproportionately, the results of that impact people in communities of color, our Black communities, our brown communities, and our API communities. Just think of nationally, the median white family holds 8 times the amount of wealth of the typical Black family, 5 times the wealth of the typical Latino family. It's an important statistic to pay attention to that speaks to the needs of building equity in communities and home ownership programs that provide resources for Black and brown and API families. So our city is working extraordinarily hard right now to lower barriers to home ownership, provide education and the path towards it through numerous housing programs, not only here in the Assessor-Recorder's office, but under the expanded resources and leadership of Mayor Breed. Our office is contributing to this effort with educational programming, such as this Family Wealth Series, and in addition to that, real resources beyond education to help people get estate plans. And that's through our new estate planning program in partnership with one of our presenters today, Hera. And we do this by applying a racial equity lens to our work. That's why it's been so important to have a presence in community, both personally and through my office, going to community events, neighborhood association meetings, holding office hours at library branches in the southeast part of our city, because I want to hear directly from San Franciscans on what resources that you need to ensure that future generations can thrive in San Francisco. So we're moving through the pandemic right now. And as we progress through our recovery, we also have to deal with the rising issues that so many of us are talking about. Rising inflation, which is fueling concern about foreclosures. Many of us are worried about and keeping up with living expenses while being at risk of missing a mortgage payment. And so during challenging times like these, we want to help homeowners connect with every resource that may be available to you to help you protect your assets. So the hope that all of us have is that today's presentation can shed some light on foreclosure prevention resources so that we can help those and you who may have fallen behind, and also raise awareness about foreclosure related items that you should be paying attention to make sure that you are on solid ground. It can be overwhelming when a person receives a letter from a mortgage company and you are not alone in that experience. So I'm very, very happy to welcome back key collaborators, partners in this journey and in this work towards housing justice. Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, also known as HERA, is a not-for-profit legal service and advocacy organization dedicated to helping Californians, particularly those who are most vulnerable, build a safe, sound financial future free of discrimination and bias, economic abuses, in all aspects of household financial concerns. I wanted to share a brief overview of the Office of the Assessor-Recorder. One moment. And just go through some of the overviews of our office just very briefly, so you have a sense of what an Assessor-Recorder does. I want to share an overview of that work because it's essential to ensuring that we can invest as a city in the programs that we care about. It's very outstanding and thoughtful work that our office does to generate billions of dollars in revenue for our city. And that, as I mentioned, is key in the city's ability to respond to the needs of everyday San Franciscans and the things that we need to thrive. So you'll learn about our latest property tax data since we successfully closed what's called our roll last week, our racial equity plan, and the resources that we've created over the past year to support home ownership. You're going to see throughout this presentation that our office is focused on value, financial in the revenues that we generate, and also the cultural aspect of that work in community to expand public understanding of what our office does, building financial capacity, and promoting the values that we care about as a city collectively around equity and serving historically underserved communities. Then I'm going to pass the mic to my colleagues to speak about the appraisal process. So as I mentioned here, there are 4 general components of what our Office of the Assessor-Recorder does. We assess all real property in San Francisco. We collect transfer taxes, not property taxes, but transfer taxes. We grant property tax exemptions, and we record public documents. And that is fundamental in providing the single most stable and secure source of funding for our city. And we know that during times like these, stability and security is very important for us to feel that we have solid ground to work from. Next slide, please. So just a quick slide here on the 2 components of the office, the assessor side of the house and the recorder side of the house. As I mentioned, focused on the city's financial resiliency through the work that we do. And very proudly, we can say that because of that work, we've seen the city's first budget surplus since 1998 as a result of our work, federal aid, and an economic boom that boosted the city's pension investments. On the assessor side, there's about 211,000 parcels that we look at. So if you are on top of a hill looking over the city, you can see in a 360-degree view all of those parcels. When you think of all the value of them together, that's about $332 billion in assessed value, which then equates generally to about $3.7 billion in property tax revenue. And then, of course, that is taking into account $20 billion of exemptions that are provided to organizations, nonprofits across the city. And then on the recorder side, you have about $513 million this year in property tax revenues that we've been successful in collecting. Through our audit program, about $72 million to date, to making sure that no money has been left on the table. That's because of partnerships that we have at the state level to ensure that everyone is paying their fair share. And I'm very proud that we've continued to diligently do that work with every resource available to bring in those dollars from corporate entities to ensure that we have those dollars for city investment. And then documents that we record in our office, about 150,000 that we do over marriage certificates, deeds, trusts are some of the most active documents of the over 250 that we manage on the recorder side of our house. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our racial equity plan. The Office of the Assessor-Recorder has this plan not just to be static, but because we are committed to advancing racial equity proactively, both internally within the work that happens inside of our office, and also using opportunities like these to connect with you about the conversation that we are having as a city around racial equity. Internally, that's about diversifying our workforce. So we have an organization that represents the community that we're serving. That matters for recruitment, that matters for the culture of an office, that matters for the training that we provide, the level of community engagement of where we spend our time and what parts of the city, the advocacy that we lend ourselves to, and of course, maintaining our operations. We know that racial prejudice and bias continue to corrode the real estate sector and city governments in the same way that those elements are corroding society at large. And so this work and this reality is particularly important for us to address. Racism evident in the real estate and its appraisal in the private market, I think, underscores the urgency and importance of promoting a culture of racial equity internally and externally. And that's very important for us at the Office of the Assessor-Recorder. We seek to promote staff diversity, as I was mentioning. We are working towards being an anti-racist organization, rejecting tokenism, ensuring that we have diversity in every division, making sure that we're aware of our individual biases, and that we're creating spaces like the one today, I hope, that where everyone feels comfortable to ask questions, express their vulnerabilities, so that we can work together to build that beloved community. Next slide, please. So our commitment to equity and strengthening community has taken us around the city, as I mentioned. We've heard from many of you about your home ownership aspirations, your questions about transferring your home to your loved ones, the need for legal resources for homeowners. And based on your input, that's why we launched our estate plan program that I talked about earlier together with Hera. Next slide, please. The estate plan consists of 4 documents: a will, a living trust, a power of attorney, a healthcare directive. And really, it's meant to ensure that the assets that you've worked so hard to create for yourselves are there for you, for your family, so that every dollar is maximized in building equity within our communities, and particularly our communities of color, Black, Brown, and API. We have 100 free estate plans or low cost, depending on your income level, free for low income, $400 for moderate income households, focusing primarily on the southeast part of San Francisco, and in addition, the western addition. It's a great value, saving you between $3,000 to $3,500. And we do hope that if you haven't taken advantage of this program, please do reach out to us so that we can connect you. We just spoke with a woman this year who said, I wish I had had this program on my radar before I paid $2,500 for just one component of what is provided through our program. So please do reach out to us. We'll also drop information in the chat section right now. Next slide, please. Also, we are answering this call in every forum that we can. We're having a conversation next month in collaboration with the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Organization, a nonprofit think tank here in San Francisco, to talk about the importance and the impact of recognizing what redlining has done to create the environment that we live in today, and how there have been active practices in the past, legally, administratively, culturally, that have prevented equity building in our communities of color. By understanding our past, we can create a better future. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, just don't hesitate to reach out to us. I know there was a lot to share with you, but just remember, we at the Assessor-Recorder's office are here to help you. There's no wrong door, so please, if you have a question, reach out to us by email, by phone, or you can always walk into City Hall and visit us on the ground floor in room 190. And you can always visit our website, where we have many answers to frequently asked questions at sfassessor.org. And now, our main event on foreclosure prevention. With us today, thank you very much for joining us, Zoe. Zoe Kemmerling from Hera. She is an expert on mortgage issues and foreclosure prevention, student loan debt, and fair credit reporting. So please feel free, while she's speaking, to type in your questions for Zoe in the Q&A box, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us. I'm excited to be part of this conversation with you. I hope you find these resources valuable. That's their intent. And with that, take it away, Zoe. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Assessor Torres. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And I have my colleague Clara here with me to help monitor the questions and advance the slides. So the first thing I want to say is that these issues that we'll be talking about today are very complex. And the goal of this presentation is to identify some of the key factors that are going to affect your rights and options if you are in a situation where you're worried about losing your home to foreclosure. Hera's contact information will be at the end of this presentation, and I encourage anyone who is in a situation where they would like individualized legal advice to call our intake line to get a chance to talk one-on-one with a staff attorney. Next slide, please. Okay, so foreclosure is when you are looking at a forced sale of your house to satisfy some kind of debt that is secured by the property. The main one that we'll be talking about today is a mortgage, but you can also find yourself in the situation due to property taxes. A PACE assessment, that stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and that's a special kind of funding that has been popular for a while, funding for energy efficient home improvements that ends up attached to your property taxes. And I'm not going to be discussing this a lot today, but just be aware that that is one issue that can lead to foreclosure. Homeowners insurance and escrow accounts go together because many people pay their insurance through an escrow account that is attached to their mortgage, so that these payments are rolled into the monthly housing payment that you're paying to your mortgage servicer. Homeowner association and condo fees are another monthly expense for many people. And to a lesser extent, certain loans you take out for maintenance and repairs can also be attached to the property in a way that in extreme situations can allow the creditor to collect the debt by obtaining a lawsuit and a judgment against the homeowner, and the right to collect by forcing a sale of the homeowner's property. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of the timeline of the foreclosure process in California. And it's important to note that this is only the timeline for mortgage foreclosures. Some of the other kinds I mentioned have special rules that we'll touch on later. So California is a non-judicial foreclosure state, and that means that a mortgage lender does not have to go to court to foreclose on your house. They only have to follow the steps on the slide and file certain documents, and then at the end of the process, they can hold a sale. So basic timeline, about 4 months after you miss a mortgage payment, lender can record a notice of default with the county. 3 months after the notice of default, they can record a notice of trustee sale, and that will have the date and location of the foreclosure auction on it. And this date must be at least 20 days after the filing of the trustee sale notice. And then at that point, the property can be sold at auction. And after that, the final steps in the process is basically like an eviction to remove the residents from the property. And like any eviction, the eviction process is a court process. You have to go through court, but at that point, things can move very fast, and the foreclosed homeowner will not have very many defenses to being finally put out of the house. I'll briefly mention cash for keys. We use that term to refer to sometimes people reach a deal with the new owner to move out by a certain date in exchange for a payment. And later on, we're also going to talk about some common scams to keep an eye out for, but I just want to mention, if you find yourself in this position, make sure the person on the other end that you're negotiating with is a legitimate representative of the owner. Next slide, please. Okay, so we just kind of discussed the timeline of the worst case scenario, but it's important to be aware of how quickly things can move. But if you have, fallen behind on a payment, or you've been behind for some time, there still can be plenty of options to work on hanging on to figure out how to hang on to the home. These are some of the basic categories of strategies to keep your home. Refinance, most people are familiar with this. Refinancing just means that you apply for a completely new loan from a new bank or lender, and you use the new loan to pay off the old loan. And as with applying for any kind of credit, To refinance, you need to qualify. So you need to have enough income and credit history to qualify for a loan. So that might not be an option for a lot of people who are struggling. Reinstatement, that term means just means paying the total amount past due on the mortgage. And a complete payoff, you have the right to make a complete payoff of the amount you owe up to 5 days before a scheduled foreclosure sale. A repayment plan just means that you reach an agreement with, for instance, your mortgage servicer to repay the amount past due in installments on top of your normal payments. Forbearance, we'll talk about some more in a bit, but this is a temporary solution where you put your payments on pause for a certain number of months. We'll talk later about how forbearance, the special forbearance plans exist for those with government-backed loans. But even outside of the special COVID-19 forbearance rules, many servicers have traditionally offered forbearance plans to people who are experiencing unemployment, for instance. A loan modification we'll also talk about more later, but this differs from a refinance in that with a modification, you are applying directly to your current servicer. You're not getting a new loan, but you're applying to modify the terms of your current loan to make the monthly payments more affordable. And at the bottom of this list is litigation, because bringing a lawsuit usually is only an option under the most extreme circumstances of misconduct, servicer or owner misconduct. And it's important to note that not all instances of bad behavior or all instances of being wronged are necessarily going to make strong legal claims to bring in court. Next slide, please. Okay, so special rules and special practices have been put in place over the last 2 years because so many people are experiencing hardship because of COVID-19. The most important distinction to make here is between homeowners with federally backed mortgages and those with purely private mortgages, because the options for private mortgages are more piecemeal. Next slide, please. So the first thing to determine is, what is a federally backed mortgage and do you have one? So federally backed mortgage is either owned or insured by a federal agency. And another important distinction I'd like to make is between owner and a servicer. A servicer is the company that you're going to be communicating with about your mortgage payments on a monthly or day-to-day basis. So they're the company that sends you your mortgage statements. They're the ones you call if you need help. And it's important to realize that you might have a federally backed mortgage, but these names that you see on the slide here are not going to be the same names that appear on your mortgage statements, because a servicer is hired to help manage your mortgage, and separate from the servicer, there is another entity who is the owner of your mortgage. And government entities that own or back mortgages include Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, FHA, the VA, and the USDA. And these are the types of federally backed mortgages. And it's important to note that even if your loan was, for instance, a Fannie Mae loan when you first took it out, does not necessarily mean it still is a Fannie Mae loan, for instance. So that's why you want to double check. Next slide, please. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we also refer to these as GSE, which stands for government-sponsored entities. They both have a lookup tool on their website where you can put in your name, address, and the last 4 digits of your social security number. And they can search their database and check to see if your loan is Fannie or Freddie. For FHA, you will see FHA appear in your loan closing documents. If you have those in your file, you can look at them. FHA loans will often have what's called a mortgage and insurance premium charge, which is a separate line on your mortgage statement. And you can always call your servicer and ask as well if your loan is FHA or Fannie or Freddie, or VA, or USDA. VA and USDA will also be indicated in the original loan documents. But again, you can always call, or another way to check is, next slide, please. So another way to check what kind of loan you have is by doing what's called a request for information. And this is a formal written letter that you mail to your servicer. You can find the correct address to mail the request to listed on your mortgage statement or on your servicer's website. And if you are interested in this, Hera can also help you submit this kind of letter. And in the letter, you can just ask for the identity of the owner of the loan and any federally related entity that owns or guarantees your loan. Next slide, please. So if you've determined that you do have one of the loans we just talked about, FHA or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, the most important thing to know is that if you are experiencing a financial hardship, whether direct or indirectly related to COVID-19, you are entitled to ask and receive a forbearance. And you do not have to provide any evidence that you're having this COVID-19 hardship. All you have to do is contact your servicer, tell them that you have a financial hardship because of the pandemic, and ask for forbearance. And depending on various factors, including when you ask and whether you were current at when COVID started back in March 2020, you'll be entitled to between a year and 18 months of forbearance time. And if your servicer offers you a forbearance of 60 or 90 days, you're entitled to extend that at the end of the period. And the most important thing to remember is that forbearance doesn't happen automatically. You have to call up and ask. Next slide, please. Now, it's important to note that being on forbearance doesn't allow you to skip those payments permanently. You'll still owe them. So when your forbearance ends, you'll have to discuss with your servicer the options for what to do next with the amount that has been forborne or the amount you still owe. And this again will depend if your mortgage is a federally backed mortgage or if it's a private mortgage. So each government-backed loan, including FHA, Fannie, and Freddie, has regulations attached to it that describe a waterfall of options that your servicers must consider in order. A waterfall of options of how to deal with those, say, 12 months that you weren't paying. And in many cases, not all cases, the servicer will go through these options without you having to submit any documentation or any kind of application. So again, it's important to be proactive, to talk on the phone with your servicer or communicate with them through your online portal, however you prefer to do things, and ask what the options are in your case. And if you're wondering what the options are in your particular case, HERA can also advise you on that and advise you on whether your servicer is describing all of the options that they are supposed to. Some common terms that you might encounter during a discussion of these options include reinstatement, which just means bringing your loan current by paying the amount you owe in full. A repayment plan, as I mentioned earlier, is where you repay the past due amount in installments on top of your regular mortgage payment, monthly payment. A deferral means when you take the arrearage, and again, arrearage or arrears means the amount by which you're behind, the amount you haven't paid, the amount past due. A deferral will take that amount and put it as a lump sum at the end of your loan, so that when you reach the end of your payment schedule, you know whether that's 10, 15, 20 years in the future. At that time, the deferred amounts will become due. And usually a deferral will include deferred principal, interest, and escrow advances. Escrow advances means amount that your servicer has fronted for you to pay the costs in your escrow account, including property taxes and insurance. So again, a deferral just means you deal with those amounts at the end of the life of the loan. A modification, as I mentioned before, is a way of recalculating your loan terms to arrive at a more affordable monthly payment. And for the federally backed loans, they will have specific formulas telling them how to calculate and offer borrowers a modification. A partial claim is similar to a deferral, but it's something specific to FHA, VA, and USDA loans, in which that entity, for instance, the FHA, will cover the arrears, cover the outstanding amount due, and create a kind of a separate zero interest subordinate loan that again becomes due at the end of the loan term. So it's a little bit like a deferral, but it is owned by a government entity. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that with federally backed loans, the agencies regulate specific waterfalls of options that the servicer must offer a borrower who is coming out of a period of forbearance. Now, these rules do not apply if your loan is purely owned by a private entity. And in that case, you will just have to ask your servicer what they offer, and it will be entirely up to the owner and the servicer. However, if you have a private loan, don't give up, because most servicers these days, realizing that so many people have financial hardships related to the pandemic, most servicers will offer some kind of option. Usually a repayment plan, a loan modification, or a deferral. A deferral is sometimes also called a balloon payment because, like I said, it's a chunk of the loan that becomes due at the end of the mortgage period. And earlier, I mentioned the request for information process, where you can send a formal letter to your servicer asking for information. And that's an option here too. You can send a request for information to your servicer and ask them what their loss mitigation options are, or if there are any restrictions on loss mitigation. So you can ask them what the rules are and what options they have to offer you. Next slide, please. A few other things to be aware of with loan modifications. A loan modification can be a good option for a lot of people, especially if you're still struggling financially, if you're worried that you won't be able to continue making mortgage payments of the same amount that you were before the pandemic. A few of these terms, sustainability, that just means to keep in mind to analyze whether you'll be able to afford the new payments of your recalculated loan. Being underwater, that means that you owe more on the house than it is worth right now. And that's not a situation many of people are in today because property values are still very high. Some servicers may tell you that they will not consider an application for a modification until the point that you're in default status. So thinking back to that timeline, the point at which an official notice of default is filed. But if they tell you that, it's worthwhile pushing back and asking again. And that's another situation where you can call HERA and we can discuss your situation with you and possibly try to advocate for you to your servicer. And then we already discussed the difference between federally backed and owned and privately owned loans. There's also federal and state laws that say that a foreclosure sale may not occur while a servicer is reviewing a complete loan modification application. So that's just to say if you have a foreclosure date coming up, it's a good idea to put that application together and send it in as soon as possible. Because if it is submitted at least 5 business days before a scheduled sale, they have to put the sale on hold. Next slide, please. Can you go back one slide? Yeah, so here is the basic components of that you usually need to send to a servicer in order for them to consider your application complete. They'll have an application form. You'll need to send your most recent income tax return. There's an IRS form called Form 4506C, which is a form allowing the servicer to look at your tax records. They'll want to see proof of income for the last 2 months, your most recent 2 months of bank statements. And if you have anyone who is not on the loan, who's contributing to the mortgage, you'll need to send in documentation of their contribution. And it's important to try to submit these documents together and as quickly as possible, because once documents sit at a servicer for a certain amount of time, the servicer will usually ask for more recent documents. And include all pages of tax returns and bank statements, even if they're blank, and keep copies of everything you send. Next slide, please. Okay, just a few notes about property taxes. If you default on your property tax, it's a different timeline than the foreclosure timeline for mortgages. You can put a repayment plan in place with the county for up to 5 years from the time you default. And a repayment plan requires a 20% down payment. I mentioned property tax reassessment, and Assessor Torres mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. But sometimes events can occur that cause your property taxes to jump. And if you need help untangling this, this is another situation that Hera can advise on. And thinking ahead, there are certain exemptions you can get if you're a senior or a disabled veteran. And there's also a postponement program through the state for seniors or homeowners who are blind or disabled. And you can apply for that program, which will defer a subsequent year's taxes until such time as the property is transferred, either through sale or death and inheritance. So to learn more about that program, can reach out to this phone number or email. And a couple slides later, I'm going to talk more about the California Mortgage Relief Program. And that program is now accepting applications for past due property taxes. Next slide, please. Homeowner association delinquencies are another kind of debt that has some special rules. And Hera can also advise on these kinds of debts. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that an HOA cannot foreclose until you have a certain amount of your assessments past due. It's $1,800. So either you owe more than $1,800 in assessments, or your debt is over a year old. You always have the right to make partial payments to an HOA, and the HOA must always apply any payment towards your assessments first before any other kind of late fees or collection costs. And the link at the end is just, it's not a law, it's not an enforceable rule, but it is guidance put out by a HOA trade group that encourages HOAs to work with homeowners who are facing hardships. Next slide, please. Okay, so the California Mortgage Relief Program is taking applications for past due mortgage debt and delinquent property taxes. And this is for people who experienced a COVID-19 hardship. You have to own and occupy a single family home, whether that's a detached home, a condo, or a manufactured home. Household income, 150% of area median income is the cap. And the maximum assistance available for mortgages is $80,000, and for property taxes is $20,000. I also on the slide put the link for San Francisco's Homeowner Emergency Loan Program. I believe there's a COVID-19 specific version of that program as well. And other counties also have relief programs. If you live in another county and are interested in this, contact Hera. Next slide, please. Previous slide, please. Oh, no, this is it. Bankruptcy, yes. So I mentioned bankruptcy briefly. I'm not a bankruptcy attorney. It's a very complex field. So if this is something you are considering, find a bankruptcy attorney to consult with as soon as possible. But sometimes, as a last resort, filing a Chapter 13 bankruptcy can stop a scheduled foreclosure sale. And if you're working with a good bankruptcy attorney, through the Chapter 13 plan, you make a schedule to pay off your past due debt. And again, you have to do this at the same time as you continue to make your regular monthly payments moving forward. Make sure that you are engaging a bankruptcy attorney who is willing to stick with you through the whole process. It's a complex process, and who is transparent about their fees. The automatic stay that's on the slide, that's what I mentioned. When you file a bankruptcy, the court can put an automatic hold on the foreclosure sale. But be aware that a lender can also petition the court to remove the hold. So again, this is why you want the advice of a qualified bankruptcy attorney if you're going this route. Next slide, please. Okay, foreclosure rescue scams. My general rule of scammers is if you get an offer that is too good to be true, it probably is. There's probably some hidden condition. And there are a lot of people and companies right now who are taking advantage of people who are desperate to keep their homes. So this is just a list of red flags. Anyone who wants you to pay them right away. Anyone who promises to get you a loan modification. Organization like HERA can give you advice about loan modifications for free. And again, if it's a private loan, not government backed, you know, they're never obligated to give you a modification. So be aware if someone promises that they can get you one. Be very careful of scammers who want you to sign over the title to your property, or who offer to take ownership of your property temporarily. That rarely ends well. Beware of lawyers who offer to file a lawsuit for you just to stop a sale or as leverage without explaining to you what kinds of legal claims you have. Always be wary if someone is asking you to sign papers without having a chance to read them and understand them and ask questions about them. Be wary if anyone asks you to make payments to someone who is not your servicer, or to stop making payments. And of course, anyone asking for your credit card number, social security number, or other personal information right off the bat is someone to watch out for. Next slide, please. And here is a list of places you can report bad actors or scammers. Your local police, the CFPB, the second line on there, that is a great place to file a complaint against anyone you're having trouble with. You can file a complaint against a scammer. You can also file a complaint against your mortgage servicer if you think they are not treating you fairly or not working with you. The Federal Trade Commission is a good place to report fraud and scams. And then the Attorney General's office deals with some issues, but not all kinds of actors. And the DFPI is a state agency that will take complaints, especially against banks and lenders. And the State Bar is where you should file a complaint if you have a complaint against a licensed attorney. At the bottom is a link for CFPB advice, more advice on avoiding scams. Next slide, please. I'm only going to mention the topic of shared equity agreements briefly, because this is not necessarily a scam, but this is an arrangement that's been on the rise recently, and something you want to be careful of. A shared equity agreement is basically when a lender offers you cash up front for the right to a certain percentage of the value that accrues in your house. And this is popular these days because property is so valuable, and people expect it to continue to appreciate. But the thing to understand if you're looking at an arrangement like this is you need to understand what you might owe when. And often people who are offering shared equity agreements will say it's not a loan because you don't have to make monthly payments. But it does function in many ways like a loan, and arguably is a loan because they're giving you money and you will owe them money at a future date in exchange. So you need to make sure you understand how much you could owe when, and think about whether you think you'd be in a position to pay that back. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. This is a overview of HERA's practice areas and our contact information. You can reach out by phone or use the web form on the website if you're interested in a consultation with an attorney. So at this point, Clara, what questions do we have?
Yeah, so someone asked, is the timeline mentioned for owner-occupied primary residence?
Oh, the foreclosure timeline. No, that is the timeline for all foreclosures for past due mortgages. The basic timeline for notice of default, notice of trustee sale, that is for any property that's secured by a mortgage. And the owner occupier distinction, that is most important if you are looking at grant funds or qualifying for assistance through a program like the California Mortgage Relief Program.
And someone else asked, any restrictions on how small partial payments can be?
For the, I assume this is the HOA slide. No, you can make a partial payment. You should be entitled to make a partial payment of any amount and have that applied towards your outstanding balance of your HOA assessments.
And then someone else said, hi, if someone offers to buy your home for cash and it's a pretty offer, do you consider that a scam too?
Sorry, and it's a what offer?
It's a pretty offer.
Like a good offer?
Yeah.
So, you know, selling your house to any entity, that's, you know, your right as a homeowner. And it's not necessarily a scam if you understand the terms and you think it's a good deal. Yeah, just because someone is offering to buy your house for cash, that could be a legitimate offer. Especially in this market when houses are very valuable, it's quite possible you might get a good offer. But the most important things to keep in mind is make sure you understand the paperwork you're signing, including all the terms like, you know, when you will receive the funds. If someone promises to give you like $10,000 now and the rest at some future date, and make sure you understand why that is and when you'll get the balance. And if you're wondering about paperwork that you're thinking of signing, you know, you can get in touch with HERA, you can get in touch with like a private real estate attorney if you want a second opinion, if it seems like they have a lot of legalese or complicated terms. Or you can ask a HUD certified housing counselor. That's another good resource. And they provide mostly free services, and you can get a referral list through HUD.
And I think that's all the questions that we have for today.
Okay, great. Yeah, if anyone else has a last minute question, please put it in the chat. Yeah, maybe we'll wait a minute and then, yeah, and then I guess it's time to wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe. We greatly appreciate your partnership and Hera's partnership as a partner collaborator organization. We look forward to the next one and hope all the attendees received all the information they needed. We will be sharing this video on YouTube and sharing those links with everyone and the presentation slides as well. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Clara and Tina, and to the assessor's office.
Awesome.